Most women enter relationships with a working definition of intimacy that was built entirely from their own experience of it. Intimacy means deep conversations. It means emotional disclosure. It means talking about feelings, about the relationship, about the future, openly, regularly, and with enough vulnerability to confirm that the connection is real. That definition is not wrong. It's just incomplete because men are operating with a fundamentally different internal model of what intimacy is, how it's built, and what it feels like when it's present. And nobody told her that. So she spent months, sometimes years, waiting for a version of closeness he was never going to deliver in the format she was expecting. While he spent the same months genuinely confused about why she kept saying she felt disconnected from a man who was right there, every day, showing up in every way he knew how. Two people, one relationship, completely different intimacy languages, and zero translation happening between them. That ends today because understanding how men actually experience intimacy, not the version women assume, not the version movies invented, is one of the most practically useful things a woman can carry into any relationship she wants to actually work. 1. For men, intimacy is built in action, not conversation. Picture two women who are close friends catching up after a few weeks apart. They sit across from each other, make direct eye contact, and talk about their feelings, their relationships, their fears, their growth. The conversation is the intimacy. The emotional disclosure happening in real time is what makes them feel connected. When they leave, they feel closer than when they arrived. That model of intimacy, face to face, verbally expressive, emotionally explicit, is so natural to most women that they assume it's simply how intimacy works. For everyone, in every relationship, including the one with the man they're trying to build something real with. It isn't. Two male friends who haven't seen each other in months will sit side by side watching a game, exchange maybe 40 words of conversation, share a meal, give each other a hard time about something, and leave feeling genuinely reconnected. Nothing deep was said, no feelings were disclosed, nobody talked about the relationship or what it means to them. And yet the intimacy was completely real. It just operated through an entirely different channel. Shared presence, parallel activity, doing something together without needing to narrate the emotional experience of doing it. Psychologists who study gender differences in social bonding describe this distinction as face-to-face versus side-by-side intimacy. Women are predominantly wired for the former, direct, verbal, emotionally disclosive connection. Men are predominantly wired for the latter, shared experience, physical presence, activity-based bonding that doesn't require emotional narration to be meaningful. Neither model is superior. Both are completely legitimate forms of human connection. But when a woman applies her intimacy model to a man and evaluates the relationship's emotional health through that lens exclusively, she will almost always conclude that something is missing, when what's actually happening is that she's measuring his love in a language he isn't speaking. The man who drives 4 hours to help her move without being asked is expressing intimacy. The one who sits next to her on the couch in comfortable silence for 2 hours because he simply wants to be near her is expressing intimacy. The one who remembers she mentioned a specific problem 3 weeks ago and quietly did something to address it without making a production of it. Intimacy. None of these required a conversation about feelings. All of them required paying attention and showing up, which is exactly how male intimacy operates at its most genuine. Research by psychologist Shelley Taylor on gender differences in stress response and social bonding found that men consistently demonstrate closeness through behavioral proximity and collaborative activity rather than verbal emotional exchange. The bonding is happening. It's just happening during the drive, during the game, during the project they're working on together, during the comfortable silence that she keeps trying to fill with conversation, because the silence feels like distance to her even when it feels like closeness to him. The practical implication of this for women is significant. If you want to build genuine intimacy with a man, doing things together matters as much, sometimes more, than talking about things together. The road trip, the cooking project, the show you watch every week without fail, the inside jokes that developed over shared experiences nobody else was present for. These are not the consolation prize version of intimacy. For him, they are the real thing, and dismissing them as insufficient because they don't match the emotional disclosure model she's familiar with means rejecting genuine connection because it arrived in an unfamiliar package. Understanding this doesn't mean abandoning the need for real conversation and emotional depth. Those matter and should be present in any healthy relationship. It means recognizing that the man sitting next to her, showing up consistently, doing things with her and for her, is not emotionally unavailable. He is emotionally present in the exact way his wiring knows how to be present. And meeting him there, instead of constantly pulling him toward a model of intimacy that feels foreign to his nervous system, is what creates the kind of genuine closeness most couples spend years trying to manufacture through conversation alone. 2. Physical intimacy is emotional intimacy. For him, this is the part where a lot of women either roll their eyes or feel a defensive reaction forming, because the cultural narrative around men and physical intimacy has been so thoroughly reduced to a punchline that the actual psychology underneath it rarely gets a fair hearing. Men want physical intimacy, therefore men are shallow. Men prioritize physical connection, therefore men are incapable of emotional depth. That conclusion is not just reductive, it is factually incorrect. And the relationships quietly suffering because of that incorrect conclusion are too numerous to count. Physical intimacy for men is not a separate category from emotional intimacy. It is not the thing he wants instead of emotional connection. For a significant majority of men, physical intimacy is the primary channel through which emotional connection is both expressed and experienced. It is not a substitute for closeness. It is how closeness feels real to him. And that distinction between physical intimacy as a replacement for emotional connection versus physical intimacy as the vehicle for emotional connection changes everything about how a woman should understand what's actually happening when this dimension of a relationship breaks down. The neurochemistry behind this is specific and worth understanding. Physical touch and intimacy trigger oxytocin release in both men and women, but research consistently shows that men have fewer alternative pathways for oxytocin production than women do. Women generate oxytocin through conversation, emotional disclosure, social bonding, and verbal affirmation, multiple channels running simultaneously. Men generate it primarily through physical touch and sexual intimacy with a partner they're emotionally invested in. This is not a character flaw, it is a neurological reality, which means that when physical intimacy is consistently absent or withheld in a relationship, a man is not just experiencing physical frustration. His primary oxytocin pathway, his main biological mechanism for feeling emotionally bonded, has been closed. And a man whose bonding chemistry is consistently blocked does not grow closer over time, he grows distant. Not because he stopped caring, but because the neurochemical architecture of his attachment is slowly being starved. Physical rejection, specifically, lands in a place most women genuinely don't anticipate. For a man who is emotionally invested in a woman, initiating physical intimacy is an act of vulnerability, arguably one of the most vulnerable things he regularly does in the relationship. It requires him to want something, show that he wants it, and risk being turned down. And being turned down, particularly when it becomes a pattern, doesn't just register as a logistical disappointment, it registers as rejection of him, his desirability, his adequacy, his value as a partner. Each instance of physical rejection that goes unaddressed chips quietly at something in him that very few men will ever verbalize, but virtually all of them feel. Research on relationship satisfaction in long-term partnerships consistently identifies physical intimacy frequency as a stronger predictor of male emotional well-being within a relationship than almost any other single variable. Men in relationships with consistently low physical intimacy report significantly higher rates of emotional disconnection, feelings of being unwanted, and relationship dissatisfaction, even when every other dimension of the relationship appears functional on the surface. He's not being shallow. His emotional health in the relationship is genuinely tied to this dimension in a way that her emotional health may not be. And treating that difference as a character flaw rather than a neurological reality produces outcomes that serve nobody. What women often miss is that for a deeply invested man, physical intimacy is frequently the most honest emotional language he has. The moment he reaches for her hand, unprompted, the hug that lasts slightly longer than necessary, the physical closeness he seeks at the end of a hard day without being able to explain why he needs it. These are not just physical impulses. They are emotional communications delivered through the only channel his nervous system fully trusts. And a woman who learns to receive those communications communications as the emotional disclosures they actually are, rather than evaluating them against a verbal intimacy standard they were never designed to meet, will understand her man's inner world with a clarity that most couples never achieve. Physical intimacy is not what he wants instead of depth. For him, it frequently is the depth, and treating it accordingly changes everything. 3. Men need to feel competent to feel close. This one doesn't get talked about in relationship spaces nearly enough, and the silence around it is actively damaging otherwise good relationships every single day. Because what's happening in those relationships looks, on the surface, like a man who is emotionally unavailable, increasingly withdrawn, or inexplicably resistant to closeness. And the woman experiencing it has usually tried everything she can think of to bridge the gap. More conversation, more emotional prompting, more direct requests for vulnerability. None of it works. And the reason none of it works is that she's been addressing the symptom while the actual cause sits completely unexamined. The cause, more often than not, is that he doesn't feel competent in the relationship. And a man who doesn't feel competent cannot fully open emotionally, because competence and emotional availability are not separate systems in male psychology. They are directly neurologically linked. Male identity is constructed from an extraordinarily early age around the concept of capability. Boys are praised for what they can do, what they can fix, what they can figure out, what they can achieve. The internal metric they develop for self-worth is relentlessly performance-based, which means that in adulthood, a man's sense of value, including his sense of value within a romantic relationship, is deeply tied to whether he feels effective, useful, and capable in that space. When he feels like he's succeeding at being her partner, emotional openness comes relatively naturally. When he consistently feels criticized, corrected, dismissed, or like nothing he does is ever quite right, the emotional walls go up, not as punishment, as self-protection. The specific behaviors that erode male competence in relationships are so common that most women don't even register them as significant. Unsolicited advice when he didn't ask for input, corrections delivered in front of others, the subtle eye roll when he handles something differently than she would have, the running commentary on how he could have done something better, the comparison to how other men handle things. Individually, each of these feels like minor feedback. Cumulatively, they send a message his nervous system receives very clearly. You are not adequate here. And a man who feels inadequate in a relationship does not become more vulnerable in that relationship. He becomes more defended. Psychologist John Gottman's decades of relationship research identified contempt, which includes dismissiveness, mockery, and consistent criticism, as the single most corrosive force in romantic relationships and the strongest predictor of relationship failure across all demographics. What's significant is that contempt doesn't have to be dramatic or intentional to do damage. Low-grade, habitual dismissiveness, the kind that becomes background noise in a relationship, produces the same emotional withdrawal in men as overt disrespect. His brain cannot distinguish between the intent behind the criticism and the impact of receiving it repeatedly. The impact is what registers. And the impact, over time, is a man who stops trying to be emotionally present because emotional presence in that environment stopped feeling safe. The inverse of this dynamic is equally powerful and significantly underutilized. A man who feels genuinely respected, genuinely appreciated for what he contributes, genuinely seen as capable by the woman he loves. That man opens up in ways that consistently surprise women who have only ever experienced the defended version of him. Because the defended version was never the real version. It was the version that developed in response to an environment where competence felt constantly under evaluation. Remove that evaluation, replace it with genuine respect and appreciation, and what emerges is frequently a level of emotional availability the woman didn't know he was capable of. This is not about manufacturing false praise or pretending everything he does is perfect. It's about the ratio, making sure that the feedback and corrections are substantially outweighed by genuine acknowledgement of what he's doing right. It's about asking for input rather than delivering unsolicited improvement notes. It's about trusting his approach even when it differs from hers, unless the outcome genuinely matters enough to warrant a conversation. It's about letting him feel effective in the relationship instead of perpetually audited. A man who feels feels competent in his relationship doesn't just perform better in it, he opens deeper in it. His emotional availability expands because the environment stopped punishing him for showing up. And the intimacy that becomes possible in that environment is the kind most couples spend years trying to access through conversation, when the actual door was never through talking, it was through respect. 4. Vulnerability operates differently in men. The single most common complaint women have about emotional intimacy with men can be summarized in one sentence: he never opens up. He doesn't talk about his feelings. He doesn't share what's going on inside. He deflects, he jokes, he changes the subject, he gives one-word answers to questions that deserved paragraphs. And after enough of those deflections, she concludes one of two things. Either he doesn't trust her enough to be vulnerable, or he simply isn't capable of it. Both conclusions feel reasonable from where she's standing. Both conclusions are almost always wrong. Male vulnerability is not absent. It is not broken. It is not a character deficiency requiring therapeutic intervention. It operates on a completely different timeline, through completely different channels, under completely different conditions than female vulnerability. And evaluating it against a female vulnerability standard is roughly equivalent to deciding someone can't swim because they don't move through water the way a fish does. The neurological basis for this difference is well documented. Research on stress response and emotional processing consistently shows that male brains, when experiencing emotional distress, demonstrate significantly higher activation in regions associated with action-oriented problem solving and significantly lower immediate activation in regions associated with verbal emotional processing. Simply put, when something emotionally significant happens to a man, his brain's first instinct is not to talk about it. It is to do something about it, think through it privately, or compartmentalize it until he has processed enough internally to know what he actually thinks and feels. Asking him to verbally disclose an emotion he hasn't finished processing yet is like asking someone to describe a painting they're still in the middle of painting. The words aren't available yet because the internal work isn't done. Female vulnerability, by contrast, frequently processes through disclosure. Talking about it is part of how it gets resolved. The conversation is not just a report on the emotional experience. It is a component of the emotional processing itself, which means women are often wired to open up in order to figure out what they feel, while men need to figure out what they feel before they can open up. These two approaches, running simultaneously in the same relationship without either person understanding the other's process, produce some of the most frustrating intimacy impasses in existence. What makes male vulnerability close down entirely, and this is where most women are unknowingly doing damage, is the response it receives when it does surface. Men are acutely aware, from decades of socialization, that emotional disclosure carries risk, that showing weakness invites judgment, that being vulnerable and having that vulnerability met with criticism, dismissal, unsolicited advice, or emotional escalation confirms every fear that made them reluctant to open up in the first place. So when a man does gather enough trust and internal readiness to share something real, something he's struggling with, something that scared him, something he's uncertain about, the response he receives in that moment is not just emotionally significant. It is data. His nervous system is running a quiet risk assessment in real time, and the outcome of that assessment determines whether the door opens wider or closes for a significantly longer period. A woman who responds to male vulnerability with immediate problem-solving mode has just communicated, without intending to, that his emotional disclosure was a problem requiring a solution rather than an experience worth sitting with. A woman who responds by immediately relating it to her own experience has shifted the focus before he finished being seen. A woman who responds with alarm or emotional escalation has confirmed his fear that his vulnerability will destabilize the emotional environment rather than deepen it. None of these responses are malicious. All of them teach him, quietly and efficiently, that opening up produces outcomes that feel worse than staying closed. The response that keeps the door open is deceptively simple. Acknowledge what he said without immediately fixing, redirecting, or escalating it. Let it land. Ask a question that goes deeper instead of immediately offering a solution or a parallel experience. Regulate your own emotional response enough that he doesn't end up managing your reaction to his vulnerability instead of experiencing the relief of having shared it. and resist the instinct to push for more than he offered in that moment, because male vulnerability that is received well and not immediately pressed for more tends to expand naturally over time, while male vulnerability that gets extracted under pressure tends to retreat permanently. He will not open up the way she opens up. He will not disclose on demand, process out loud on schedule, or produce emotional conversations at the frequency she might prefer. But a man who trusts that his vulnerability will be received without judgment, without immediate advice, without emotional fallout, that man opens up in his own time, in his own way, with a depth that consistently surprises women who have only ever pushed and gotten resistance. The pushing wasn't getting resistance because he had nothing to give. It was getting resistance because the environment made giving feel dangerous. Remove the danger, and what emerges is frequently more than she expected. 5. Men gauge intimacy by how safe you make them feel. Everything covered so far in this video traces back to a single underlying concept that most relationship content gestures toward without ever fully unpacking: emotional safety. Not as a buzzword, not as a therapy talking point that gets nodded at and then left undefined. As a specific, practical, behavioral reality that either exists in a relationship or doesn't, and whose presence or absence determines almost everything about how deeply a man is willing to go emotionally with the woman he's with. When a man pulls back emotionally, when he goes quiet, when he stops sharing, when the conversations stay surface level, no matter how many times she tries to go deeper, the explanation that gets reached for most often is that he's emotionally unavailable, that he's damaged, that he doesn't want real intimacy. And occasionally that's true, but far more frequently, what's actually happening is that something in the dynamic has made emotional intimacy feel unsafe. And a man who doesn't feel emotionally safe does not become more open over time. He becomes more strategic about what he reveals, sharing enough to maintain the relationship while protecting the parts of himself that feel most vulnerable to damage. Emotional safety for men is not the same concept as emotional safety for women, and this distinction matters enormously. For women, emotional safety is frequently about feeling heard, validated, and free from judgment when expressing feelings. For men, emotional safety has an additional, equally critical dimension: the confidence that vulnerability will not be used against him, that what he shares in a moment of openness will not become ammunition in a future argument, that admitting uncertainty won't get permanently filed as incompetence, that expressing fear won't get treated as weakness that changes how she sees him, that his inner world, when he chooses to share it, will be handled with the same care he extended by sharing it in the first place. This fear is not irrational. It comes from real experience, both in relationships and in the broader socialization of men, where emotional disclosure has historically produced negative outcomes far more reliably than positive ones. A man who opened up to a previous partner and watched his vulnerabilities get weaponized during conflicts doesn't forget that lesson. His nervous system cataloged it under evidence that opening up is dangerous and adjusted his default behavior accordingly, which means the woman he's with now is frequently navigating the accumulated scar tissue of experiences she had nothing to do with, and wondering why he won't let her in when she's given him no reason not to trust her. Building emotional safety for a man requires understanding what specifically destroys it, and the list is more specific than most women realize. Using things he shared privately as evidence in arguments is one of the fastest ways to permanently close a man's emotional disclosure. The moment he realizes that vulnerability he offered in intimacy can be retrieved and deployed against him during conflict, the internal risk assessment shifts dramatically. Every subsequent moment of potential openness gets filtered through that experience. He's not being paranoid. He's being rational about what the data showed him. Consistency matters in ways that get underestimated. A man who experiences a partner whose emotional responses are unpredictable, warm and receptive one day, reactive and critical the next, cannot relax into emotional openness because he can never fully predict which version of the environment he's entering. Emotional safety requires a certain baseline predictability, not perfection, not the absence of difficult emotions, just enough consistency that he can reasonably anticipate how genuine disclosure will land on any given day. Unpredictability produces vigilance, and vigilance and vulnerability cannot occupy the same space simultaneously. What builds emotional safety is equally specific, keeping what he shares in confidence, never deploying private disclosures as weapons, never sharing them outside the relationship without permission, responding to his vulnerability with curiosity rather than correction, maintaining enough emotional regulation during difficult conversations that he isn't managing her distress instead of experiencing the safety of being heard, following through consistently on what she says she values, because a man watches behavior far more than he listens to declarations, and safety is established through patterns, not promises. Psychologists studying secure attachment formation in adult relationships identify consistent, predictable emotional responsiveness as the primary mechanism through which one partner creates felt security in another. It's not grand gestures of understanding, it's the accumulation of small moments where he shared something real and nothing bad happened, where he showed uncertainty and she didn't lose respect for him, where he expressed a fear and she held it carefully instead of immediately trying to fix it, or worse, adding to it. Each of those moments deposits something into an internal trust account that gradually, over time, makes deeper and deeper emotional access feel safe enough to attempt. A man who feels genuinely emotionally safe with a woman doesn't need to be coaxed into intimacy. He moves toward it naturally because the environment stopped making closeness feel like a liability. And the depth of connection that becomes available when that safety is fully established is the kind most relationships spend years trying to manufacture through techniques and conversations when the actual foundation was never a technique. It was just a woman who made him feel that being known by her was the safest thing he could allow. Men are not emotionally unavailable. They are emotionally different. And that difference, left untranslated, creates the kind of quiet disconnection that slowly hollows out relationships that had every reason to work. Intimacy for him is built in action, not just conversation. Physical connection is emotional connection, not a substitute for it. He needs to feel competent before he can feel close. His vulnerability operates on its own timeline and collapses under pressure. Emotional safety is the foundation everything else is built on. And when he pulls back after genuine closeness, it is a cycle completing, not a relationship ending. None of this means her needs matter less. None of this means she adjusts everything and he adjusts nothing. What it means is that two people who genuinely understand how the other experiences intimacy stop talking past each other and start actually reaching each other. And the depth of connection that becomes possible in that space is something most relationships spend years accidentally preventing. Understanding him was never about losing yourself. It was always about finally being able to find each other. If this video gave you a moment of recognition about your relationship, your past, or something you've been trying to understand for a long time, drop it in the comments. Be specific. This community reads every single comment, and many receive personal responses, because what you're navigating genuinely matters here. If this gave you real clarity today, do something with it. Like it, share it with a woman who needs this perspective right now, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel. This is the kind of honest, psychology-backed relationship content that keeps coming. And every video is built to give you the kind of insight that actually changes how you show up in love. You don't need a perfect relationship. You need a real one, and real starts with understanding.